Imagine a medieval castle glowing in candlelight, its stone walls echoing with music and laughter. Gold goblets shimmer under torchlight, and nobles in silk and velvet fill the grand hall. This is not just a royal wedding, it's a political spectacle. The young heir to the throne is marrying a girl of noble blood, delicate, graceful, and terrified. Their union is meant to bring peace between rival houses. But that night, something happens that will turn this alliance into legend. A night that would later be whispered about as the most scandalous wedding of the Middle Ages. Trumpets sound. Long tables overflow with roasted pheasants, honey-glazed pies, and red wine that flows like rivers. Every eye in the room watches the couple. The groom, handsome, confident, perhaps a little arrogant, lifts his cup and laughs loudly, basking in the admiration around him. The bride sits quietly beside him, pale as ivory, her hands trembling as she folds them in her lap. She knows that tonight her life changes forever, not because of love, but because duty demands it. In those days, a marriage was not complete until the night was consummated. That single act meant everything: legitimacy, heirs, honor, and the approval of the church. Without it, the marriage could be annulled. And so the guests weren't only celebrating. They were waiting. Whispers passed between noblewomen behind jeweled fans. "Will he manage?" one murmured with a sly smile. "He's young but proud," another replied. Even the king's advisors exchanged knowing glances. They had seen too many political unions fail in silence. As the evening grew darker, the air grew heavier with wine, laughter, and tension. The groom toasted to his bride, to the future, and to his own courage. His words were met with cheers and pounding fists on the table. Yet under the noise, one could feel the undercurrent of curiosity, almost hunger, for the private drama that was yet to unfold. At last, the music softened. Servants carrying torches appeared, ready to lead the young couple to their chamber. The crowd erupted into applause. The bride rose slowly, the silk of her gown whispering against the floor. The groom turned to the guests with a grin that would soon be remembered in every corner of the kingdom. "Don't worry," he said with arrogant charm. "This marriage will be remembered." Laughter filled the hall. Someone shouted, "Prove it, my lord!" and others raised their cups. But beneath the cheers, the king frowned, and the queen lowered her eyes. They knew the boy too well. When he made promises, he kept them, even the reckless ones. The heavy oak doors closed behind the newlyweds. The hall fell silent except for the crackle of torches. The night outside was quiet, the moon bright and watchful. Minutes passed, then an hour. Then, from behind the closed doors, came a quiet signal, the bolts sliding open, a servant emerging to nod to the steward. It was done. The marriage was officially complete. The guests cheered, laughing and clapping as though they themselves had won a battle. "To the new union!" someone cried. But the laughter had barely faded when another rumor rippled through the crowd. The groom had returned to the chamber again. No one could believe it. Not once, but twice. And by dawn, that number would rise again. And the story would spread beyond the castle walls, carried by gossip, envy, and awe. The scandal of the century had just begun. The night was far from over. While the newlyweds disappeared behind the heavy oak doors, the guests in the great hall were far too drunk on wine and curiosity to sleep. The torches burned lower, but the gossip only grew louder. The sound of cups clinking and whispers spreading through the crowd filled the hall like smoke. Some claimed they had heard laughter from the chamber. Others swore they saw the candlelight flicker under the door twice. A nobleman leaned across the table with a sly grin. "I told you, the boy's got the blood of his father," another, half drunk and jealous, muttered. "Or maybe the poor girl just prays for mourning." At the far end of the table, the king's advisor rolled his eyes, pretending not to listen, but even he could not hide a smirk. Across from him, the queen's ladies tried to hush their giggles behind jeweled hands. The entire court had turned into a theater, and the unseen chamber upstairs, its stage. An hour later, when a servant entered to refill the wine, the murmurs stopped. Everyone's eyes fixed on him. The young man hesitated, swallowed, and whispered something into the steward's ear. The steward's eyebrows rose. Then, unable to contain himself, he laughed. Once again, the same message spread like wildfire. The groom had returned to the chamber. The hall erupted in disbelief. Nobles stood, laughing, cheering, pounding their cups on the table. Twice, in one night, one shouted. "He's making history already," yelled another. The musicians began to play again, faster this time, as if the rumor itself was worth celebrating. But not everyone was amused. The bride's mother, pale and trembling, whispered to her husband, "This is no longer a wedding. This is humiliation." He said nothing. He knew the damage was already done. Their daughter's name would forever be tied to a tale told in jest. Meanwhile, upstairs, silence returned to the corridor outside the bridal room. The guards posted their exchanged glances, pretending not to hear anything. Their faces were blank, but their thoughts ran wild. In medieval courts, news traveled faster than fire. By morning, this story would spread beyond the castle, to servants, to the streets, and eventually to the distant monasteries where chroniclers would record it as a miraculous display of vigor. Downstairs, the air grew heavier with wine and heat. Someone stood on a table and toasted loudly, "To the groom, may his strength build an empire." The laughter that followed was half admiration, half mockery. Even those who envied him couldn't resist joining in. The queen rose slowly from her seat, her face unreadable. "Enough," she said softly, but her voice carried. The musicians stopped. The laughter froze. For a brief moment, silence reclaimed the hall. Then the king, raising his goblet with a wry smile, muttered, "Let the boy have his moment. He's proving more than politics tonight." The tension broke like glass. The crowd laughed again, relieved. The feast continued, but something had changed. What began as a royal celebration had turned into a scandal in real time. Every servant, every guest, now watching the stairs, waiting for what would happen next. And then, just before dawn, it did. A third whisper, a third nod. By the time the first light of morning touched the castle towers, the entire court was buzzing. The groom had done it 3 times in one night. No one could tell whether to cheer or to blush. Some called it strength, others called it madness, but everyone knew. This night would never be forgotten. And as the castle bells rang to greet the sunrise, the laughter of the guests echoed like prophecy. The scandal had only begun, and soon all of Europe would hear about it. When dawn broke over the castle, the world outside was silent. But inside the stone walls, whispers roared like thunder. Servants carried trays of bread and honey through the halls, pretending not to hear the laughter echoing behind every door. The scent of wine still lingered in the air, mixed with smoke, sweat, and scandal. By sunrise, everyone in the castle knew. The story had traveled faster than the bells could ring. The young prince, the new husband, had accomplished the impossible. 3 times in one night. Some called it passion, others called it pride. But everyone agreed on one thing: it would be remembered. At the high table, where the morning feast was laid out, the king sat in silence. His eyes were heavy, his thoughts unreadable. Across from him, the queen stirred her wine without drinking. Every few seconds, she glanced at the staircase, waiting for her son to appear. When he finally did, dressed in silk and gold, smiling like a man who had conquered the world, the entire room erupted into applause. He bowed, his grin unshakable. "My lords," he said, "it seems the kingdom rests well." The hall burst into laughter, loud and unrestrained. Some nobles cheered, others whispered behind their goblets. The priests looked away, pretending to find their food more interesting. The bride, however, did not appear. Her chamber doors remained closed, guarded by 2 servants who turned away anyone foolish enough to knock. Her absence only fueled the gossip. "She's fainted," one woman whispered. "No," another replied. "She's ashamed." A knight leaned closer, smirking. "Ashamed? She's part of history now." The servants who had stood guard that night were now the most popular men in the castle. Every noble wanted to know the details, the timing, the proof, the truth. And though they said little, their smirks told everything. By noon, the scandal had escaped the castle walls. Messengers carried news to nearby towns. By evening, it reached the capital. And by the end of the week, minstrels were already turning the story into a song. It was said that in one tavern, a bard stood before a laughing crowd and sang, "3 times for love, 3 times for pride, a groom who conquered night's divide." The tale spread like wildfire, twisting as it went. Some claimed the bride wept with joy, others that she begged for mercy. In every version, the prince was the hero, strong, daring, unstoppable. The truth, as always, was lost beneath the legend. Inside her chamber, the young bride sat by the window, staring at the pale morning light. Her ladies whispered, begging her to eat. She did not answer. She could still hear the laughter below, the cheers, the songs, the endless repetition of that number. 3. For her, it was not triumph. It was exposure. What had once been private was now public property. Her name would be remembered, yes, but not for grace, nor wisdom, nor kindness. Only for what had happened that night. Meanwhile, the groom basked in the attention. He walked through the courtyard as if crowned anew, his every step followed by admiration and envy. Men toasted to him, women blushed in his presence. He had not only fulfilled his duty, he had become legend. But in the shadows, the king's council was not laughing. To them, this was a disaster. Diplomats whispered that the foreign bride's family was furious. What was meant to be a symbol of alliance had become a public embarrassment, a scandal too loud to silence. And yet, the more they tried to suppress it, the louder it grew. That night, when the prince raised his cup again, someone shouted from across the hall, "3 times, my lord?" He only smiled. "History deserves witnesses," he replied. And just like that, a moment that should have faded into privacy became immortal. The wedding that was meant to unite 2 houses had done something far greater. It united every tongue in Europe. A legend was born. But legends, like fires, burn brightest before they consume everything around them. What began as laughter at dawn soon turned into whispers of danger. The story that had entertained nobles and servants alike now crossed borders. Messengers carried it from one court to another, each retelling adding a twist. By the time it reached foreign lands, the tale was no longer about love or strength. It was about arrogance, humiliation, and power gone too far. In the royal council chamber, the king listened in silence as his advisors spoke. "The northern lords mock us," one said. "The bride's family demands an apology," said another. And then came the quiet voice of the archbishop. "My lord, the church calls this celebration excessive." The king's jaw tightened. What had begun as his son's youthful pride was now a matter of diplomacy. A single night had become a weapon in the hands of his enemies. Meanwhile, the prince didn't seem to notice. He walked the halls with his usual grin, basking in the attention. Wherever he went, men greeted him with jokes, women with blushing smiles. To him, the scandal was victory, proof of his virility, his legend. He didn't see the storm gathering behind the laughter. The queen, however, did. Late at night, she entered her son's chambers, closing the door behind her. "You've made yourself a hero," she said softly. "But at what cost?" He laughed, raising his goblet. "History will remember me, mother." She stared at him. "Yes, but will it remember you as a king or a fool?" Down the corridor, the bride remained hidden from the world. Her chamber was guarded not for her protection, but to preserve appearances. Letters from her homeland piled up unanswered. Every word of sympathy only deepened her shame. In the songs sung beyond the castle, she had no name, only a title, the bride who survived the night. In the streets of the capital, people told the story with laughter, not reverence. Market women joked that the young prince was a lion, while the priests warned that pride would invite divine punishment. And somewhere between those extremes, the truth began to twist again. One afternoon, as the prince rode through the courtyard, a group of soldiers began chanting his name. It started as flattery but ended as mockery. 3 times, my lord. 3 times. They shouted. He smiled at first. Then he saw the smirk of a general watching from the balcony. It wasn't admiration anymore. It was derision. In the council, the king's patience was fading. The alliance is in jeopardy, he thundered. Our son's bedchamber has become Europe's theater. No one dared respond. The silence was heavy, broken only by the flicker of firelight on the marble floor. The queen's hand trembled as she folded a letter from the bride's family. They say their daughter has been humiliated beyond repair, she whispered. They demand she be returned. But that could not happen. A royal marriage could not be undone without destroying the crown's credibility. The only thing worse than scandal was weakness. And so, the royal family did what monarchs always did. They pretended nothing had happened. The celebrations continued, but the laughter sounded hollow. The musicians played, but their songs carried unease. Behind every toast and smile was fear. Fear of what would happen if this story continued to spread. And yet, it did. A French envoy arrived days later, bringing greetings from his king. Over dinner, he raised his cup and said with a sly grin, "We have heard that your prince is most accomplished." The courtiers laughed nervously. The king's face froze. In that instant, he realized the truth. The scandal could no longer be controlled. The story that had made the prince famous was making the kingdom weak. That night, when the candles in the hall burned low and the guests finally dispersed, the king stood alone before the great window, looking out at the dark horizon. He wanted to be remembered, he murmured, and he will be, for the wrong reasons. The laughter had turned into a curse, and the night that made a legend was now threatening to destroy a dynasty. For days, the castle lived in uneasy celebration. The scandal had become a ghost that walked the corridors, invisible yet everywhere. Laughter still echoed through the halls, but it was nervous, forced. The servants bowed lower, the courtiers spoke softer, and the bride's door remained shut. Inside her chamber, the young woman sat before the mirror, her wedding crown resting on the table beside her. The golden thread that once symbolized victory now looked like a chain. Her ladies tried to comfort her, but there were no words left. Outside those walls, her name had become a joke, sung in taverns, whispered in courts, etched into the memory of every noble in the realm. The prince had not visited her since that night. Whether out of pride, guilt, or simply arrogance, no one knew. He spent his days hunting, drinking, smiling for the crowds. A hero of the people. But every time someone shouted, "3 times, my lord!" a shadow crossed his face. What had once been glory now began to taste like poison. One evening, the queen entered the bride's chamber. The room smelled of lavender and loneliness. "My child," she began softly, "you must show yourself. The court grows restless." The bride looked up, her voice fragile but steady. "Restless for what? For another performance?" The queen said nothing. There was nothing to say. In the great hall below, the court was preparing for a royal feast meant to silence the rumors. Diplomats, nobles, and priests had been invited. The idea was simple. If the royal family appeared united, the scandal might fade. But everyone knew it was a desperate illusion. When the bride finally appeared, the hall fell silent. She wore a gown of pale silver, her face calm, her eyes unreadable. The prince rose to greet her, the perfect image of charm. They sat side by side, speaking little. The music began, but the air was thick with tension. As the feast continued, one noble dared to break the silence. He raised his cup and said with a smirk, "To our young prince, may his strength never fade." The hall erupted in uneasy laughter. The prince forced a smile, but his hand clenched around his goblet. The bride stared down at her plate, unmoving. When the laughter finally died, she lifted her gaze and spoke, softly, but clearly enough for all to hear. "May strength serve wisdom," she said. "Otherwise it is only noise." The hall froze. Every eye turned to her. The prince's smile disappeared. For a moment no one breathed. Then the queen rose, clapping her hands. "To the royal couple," she said quickly. The musicians resumed their song, but the message had been delivered. The bride had broken her silence, and with one sentence, she had changed everything. After that night, the mood in the castle shifted. The gossip lost its laughter. No one dared joke in her presence. Even the prince began to avoid the jesting of others. In public, he still played the part of the charming hero. But in private, his pride began to crack. He could feel the weight of her calm, a silence more powerful than any accusation. Beyond the castle, the legend took a darker turn. Minstrels no longer sang of passion or triumph. Instead, their songs hinted at tragedy, of a groom who sought glory and a bride who carried the shame. The same tale that had once been entertainment was now a warning. And so, the story began to shift. What had started as laughter now echoed as lesson. For the first time since the wedding, the prince stopped smiling. He stood at the balcony one night, looking over the dark horizon where torches flickered in the distant villages. He could hear faint laughter carried by the wind, laughter about him. The sound cut deeper than any sword. He realized then that his greatest victory had already become his greatest defeat. Years later, the castle stood silent, its walls still whispering the story that had begun with laughter. The torches that once burned in celebration had long gone out, but the tale lived on, retold by bards, written by monks, and exaggerated by every generation that followed. The prince, once adored, had become a man burdened by his own legend. The laughter that once lifted him now haunted every corridor he walked through. Wherever he went, the whispers followed 3 times, 3 times. It was supposed to mean triumph. Now it sounded like mockery. He avoided his wife, though she no longer hid from him. She had grown into a queen, quiet, poised, and distant. Her calm presence filled the court more powerfully than his pride ever had. She did not need to speak. Her silence alone reminded everyone of what had happened, of what it had cost. In time, the kingdom began to change. The laughter faded, replaced by stories of regret. The prince had aged, but the tale remained young, passed like wildfire across borders. To the common people, he was a symbol of excess, the man who turned love into a game and pride into punishment. To the nobles, he was a warning. The royal historians tried to rewrite the story, to bury the scandal under layers of ceremony and reverence. They called that night a celebration of dynastic strength. But no one believed them. Truth, once unleashed, never truly dies. One evening, years after that infamous wedding, the prince, now king, sat alone in the great hall. The same hall where the laughter once roared. His crown rested beside him, heavier than ever. The musicians were gone, the voices silent. Only the wind moved through the empty space, carrying faint echoes of the past. He poured himself a cup of wine and looked toward the stairs that once led to the bridal chamber. 3 times, he muttered bitterly, and I thought it would make me immortal. A voice came from the doorway, the queen. Older now, her face lined with quiet dignity. She stepped forward and met his gaze. You are immortal, she said softly, but not for what you wanted. He looked at her for a long moment, the woman who had once been the frightened bride. There was no anger in her eyes, only truth. Perhaps that was the cruelest part. The next morning, the king ordered that the songs about his wedding be banned. The bards were forbidden to sing of it, the chronicles sealed. But it was too late. The legend had already escaped, carried on tongues and ink across the continent. You cannot silence a story that the world loves to repeat. Centuries later, travelers would still tell the tale, sometimes as a joke, sometimes as a warning. A story of a prince whose pride burned brighter than his wisdom. A man who wanted to be remembered, and was, and somewhere, beneath the ruins of that ancient castle, the echo of that laughter still lingers, the laughter of guests, of courtiers, of fate itself. Because in the end, that night wasn't about love, or passion, or glory. It was about the danger of pride, and how even the greatest of men can be undone by the legends they create.